What is your response to the tariffs this week?
Well, I don't think the first round effects of those tariffs will be particularly significant for the whole New Zealand economy. There may be some individual businesses have some serious consequences, but it's less than 0.2% of New Zealand's GDP. I think the more important thing is it's another step in the unwinding of the rules-based order that we've experienced. Well, that's really helped the world since World War II. The UN's in tatters, the OECD's pretty ineffective on tax matters. The World Trade Organisation's obviously ineffective. The US has pulled out of the World Health Organisation. Things are in pretty dire state.
Donald Trump has consistently bucked conventional political wisdom, and on some occasions, his supporters would argue that he has been proven right. Is there any scenario in which this economically benefits either the US or the global economy?
Well, all of the economic pundits are saying there's a slowdown coming in the world economy. There's a pathway through for New Zealand. I don't think New Zealand needs to panic, and we certainly shouldn't put in countervailing tariffs. Is there possible for some good to come out of this? Well, look, as in all things, there's generally two sides to every story, and there is some legitimate complaint on the part of the US in respect of the massive goods surplus that's run by the likes of Germany and to a certain extent Canada because of the tariffs they've imposed on the US. So it is possible, I suppose, that there will be these things will be revisited, and some of those things would be remedied. Now, if they are, what happens next is the question. And you might have said that I think that we should be trying to get Europe into CPTPP.
Yeah, talk to us about that, because CPTPP is, obviously central to New Zealand's current trade standing. The UK is part of it, the EU not yet.
That's correct. Now, CPTPP is essentially ahead of World Trade Organisation rules now. It's a really good agreement. If we could get Europe in there, it's already got a lot of Asia in, Japan, Canada, Mexico, us, Australia. It was actually originally a New Zealand initiative with Singapore and a couple of other countries. That would effectively become the de facto World Trade Organisation, in my view.
Yeah.
So I think the New Zealand government trade officials, who are outstanding, by the way, they should be on their bike to Europe to see whether that's a possibility.
What will the level of enthusiasm be in Europe, given they have 20% tariffs? The EU has 20% tariffs with the US right now.
Well, I think if the US, the US is very nervous at the moment. Partly it relates to security issues arising out of Ukraine. And the withdrawal of the implicit US security guarantee, which looks less reliable these days. But partly it is these tariff wars that are around, and there will be some wise heads in all of these governments trying to find a pathway through.
But you think the level of enthusiasm in Europe and in the EU is likely to be there for joining the CPTPP?
I was in Europe a few weeks ago. This idea was mentioned to me by someone who is very senior in trade channels over there. But I think it relies as a prerequisite probably on some agreement being reached between the US and Europe.
Right. In order to lower the tariffs, you mean, in the first place?
If the EU has had to lower some of their tariffs that penalise American exports into Europe, they've got less to lose by joining CPTPP.
Okay, so that should
and a lot to gain.
That should be a priority for New Zealand trade officials. What about bringing China into the CPTPP?
China has applied to come into CPTPP. I think that's under consideration. I think it would be natural for New Zealand to want to see where things settle a little bit before taking that step. We've obviously already got a secure relationship with China ourselves through our bilateral free trade agreement. So we, from our perspective, we don't need China in there. But if China was willing to agree to the standards that are in CPTPP and the EU area was already in, that could be a good thing too.
What have you observed about how these tariffs and Donald Trump's policies are affecting the trading relationships between some of these big Asian economies, the likes of Japan, South Korea and China?
Well, just this last week, the opposite of what the US probably wanted to happen, we saw Japan, South Korea and China talking again about the RCEP agreement and whether they should use that agreement to do what I've suggested would be a good thing for CPTPP.
So an unintended consequence, perhaps.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Look, I suppose the underlying issue I have here is the pretense that the current system doesn't work for the US. Overall it does. They've got very high per capita GDP, and some of the internal problems that they have in their country are caused not by tariffs, but they're caused by some of their internal settings, which mean that the fruits of that economy, which are massive, aren't shared around very fairly.
What did you make of the Trump administration's assessment that New Zealand puts a 20% tariff on the US?
Well, it's a fabrication. It's an untruth. It's not true. GST is a consumption tax. It's not a tariff. And if we didn't do that when people import goods, New Zealand manufacturers would be cleaned out by unfair competition from other countries that effectively didn't pay GST on the goods that were sold. So the US administration must know that. They must know that. So I have to say I'm pretty disappointed at the quality of the analysis on the US side on that. In fact, we've got amongst the lowest tariffs in the world. Maybe that's the reason why they've only pinged us with 10%. And in terms of those effects, given that France has got a higher rate of tariff and wine exports into the US are one of our higher tariffs, even though our higher sales products, even though that tariff's going to be now 10%, it's going to be lower than the French one. Who knows what will happen? Maybe New Zealand wine sales to the US will go up.
Yes, well, I mean, there could be some net positive effect for some of our exporters, I suppose, although I note that I think Sauvignon Blanc is our highest selling wine in the US, and of course California has a Sauvignon Blanc crop as well. So anyway, we'll have to
it'll play out.
I want to step back and consider this more broadly for a moment. So if the US is prepared to hurt its supposed friends and allies economically, the security and defence implications, I would think, are significant. Can countries trust the United States?
Well, I wouldn't want to say. I wouldn't want to give an equivocal yes/no answer to that. I think the proper question is: do countries trust the US administration as much as they used to? And I think it would be fair to say that there has been an erosion of that. You see that in Europe. The way that Zelensky was treated, the way in which some of the statements that have been made by the US administration attacking European interests. What are the implications of that for the world? Well, it's obvious that countries like Canada and Europe, who thought that the US was their most reliable security partner, are thinking a bit more about that. What will be the implications of that into the Pacific? They'll be serious.
Well, let's talk about defence then. AUKUS Pillar 2?
Oh, dead. It's got to be dead in the water. I've for a long time thought it was an unwise idea. The last administration described it as a China containment strategy. We are moving from a unipolar world where we had one superpower, the US, after the demise of Russia, to rising other superpowers. Now, superpowers always flex their muscles a bit close to home. US does that. They're doing it at the very moment with Panama, trying to reduce Chinese influence to Panama. Back in the day, the UK did it, go back further, Italy, France, etc. So it's not surprising that China is flexing its muscles more close to home. That doesn't mean that we're comfortable with everything that they do in the Pacific, because from our perspective, or from my perspective, our greatest defensive attribute is our isolation. And if that isolation is undermined by rising influence of China into the Pacific, that undermines that isolation. So given that the US is withdrawing US aid from the Pacific Islands, New Zealand and Australia are going to have to do more in that space, because that's essentially the key to our security.
Yeah, talk to us about that. You think, you are proposing, that for every dollar New Zealand spends on defence and security, we match it dollar for dollar when it comes to aid in the Pacific? I think
we must do. It's always hard to increase aid because there are always budget pressures, but what could aid do? We need to help them with decent banking services, with decent internet services. We need to help them fish their fish. The fisheries in that area are the greatest income source for those Pacific fisheries. They're mainly fished by overseas countries in the Pacific territories, except for France, who fishes their own. So can we help them build a fishing fleet in order to, we wouldn't give it to them, we'd lease it to them, but can we help them build a fishing fleet so they maximise the value of their own fishery?
So why is that in our defence interests?
Because otherwise, if other countries become pervasive with perhaps a different set of values, pushing their values in the Pacific, you could have different outcomes. It is possible that you could over time have a fishing fleet that could over time morph into something that's a paramilitary fishing fleet, We see that in parts of the South China Sea. I think it's in New Zealand's interest that we help the Pacific succeed. We want them to grow. We've got these great people-to-people links. More Polynesian people live in New Zealand than any other part of the world other than Polynesia itself. And indeed in some of those countries, more people live in New Zealand than live in the original home country. So we've got these great people-to-people links, and wouldn't it be great if we kept this area demilitarised?
You think there should be a Pacific peace zone? Yeah,
I think we need a new framing through which to work. In some ways, it's a phrase, a Pacific peace zone, that through which we could work with the Pacific countries and the superpowers to see if we can reach an agreement. New Zealand's role in the world, I think, traditionally has been try to navigate a peaceful path between superpowers. We're obviously not non-aligned. We align with countries that share our values, most importantly Australia, another democracy like ours, but also countries like Japan and the United States. So I think Helen Clark put it very well recently when she said that we need to be clear-eyed and have courteous relationships with both the US and China, reach out to the Pacific Rim countries like Japan, Indonesia, Australia, the other countries that share our interests, and our European allies.
What would a Pacific peace zone actually mean?
European friends.
What would it look like?
Well, we would be trying to stop the militarisation of the Pacific, essentially.
So basically you say no military operations, undertakings, infrastructure in any of these countries?
We don't need foreign countries having military bases in the Pacific Islands, and if we did, that would threaten our interests. So we need to avoid that. How do we avoid that? We got to, diplomacy requires foreign affairs efforts to try and explain to other countries what our position is. We also, I think, need to maintain some military capability. The frigates that actually were originally purchased by a Labor government under David Lange, they're now worn out. They need to be replaced. What are we going to replace them with? How much do we spend on them? You go really high spec, they're mega expensive. On the other hand, they need some military capability in order to deal with some of the bad actors. You might have seen recently, some ships that were carrying drugs. Those sorts of ships have arms on board as well. You've got to be careful if you're going to board them. So you need some military capability, but they don't need to be perhaps the most expensive ships in the world, and maybe you spend the other money on drones.
Okay, I'll ask about drones in just a moment. But to be clear, is that the kind of adversary we should be having our defence assets? We should be investing our defence assets for. So we should be thinking about drug runners as opposed to trying to get naval assets that can compete with the Chinese military.
I'm not sure I'd like to talk about competing with the Chinese Navy, because I don't want to position them as a military foe. So I won't agree with that language. But I think it's fair for our partners like Australia to expect that we have some military capability. Obviously, we're never going to be a superpower. But when you replace the frigates, they do need some military capability.
Drones. You say that New Zealand should prioritise working with Australia to develop marine and air drones, and you say we should, quote, commit significant resources. Talk us through that.
There's an Australian called Sam Roggevin who wrote a book called The Echidna Strategy, and an echidna is a bit like a porcupine. It's a prickly animal. And he said that's how Australia should present itself to the world defensively. It should be a prickly adversary. Ukraine, it's incredible, but they have kept the Russian sea fleet in port in the Black Sea through the use of drones. Incredible. And it just shows you how the world has changed, that these massive ships that had this ability to sort of probably pound Odessa into submission have not been able to leave port now because of marine drones and air drones, and we've all seen it on the news. Now, the nature of war is changing, perhaps to the advantage of New Zealand, because multiple small drones are now affordable. They're not like the cost of a multi-billion-dollar frigate. They're, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, not billions. So we've got capability in that area. We've got great capability, we've got surprising depths of capability in space stuff from Rocket Lab, and marine jets from Hamilton Jet. We already produce really sophisticated drones that use artificial intelligence and recognition technology to try and target wilding pines, carrying significant payloads. Yes, I think we should be working on that. Look, Australia, I don't know if you've ever seen that great comedy piece by John Clark on The Front Fell Off.
Yes.
And he talks about the boats saying, no cardboard, no string. Here we are with, cardboard drones produced in Australia being used for military effect deep into Russian territory from the Ukraine. The world's changing.
Yeah. Finally, you have been outspoken in your criticism of social media platforms. A lot of the global turmoil and increasing societal polarisation we're seeing around the world, you pin on those platforms. Why are they to blame for the current turmoil in the world?
Well, we've made a mistake in the West. We've allowed those platforms to be irresponsible, and they're greedy owners who are so selfish are ruining civilization, in my opinion. They're ruining democracies around the world. And I know that's quite a strong statement, but I believe it to be true. The youth suicide rate, mental health problems with young people, people getting ripped off all of their savings from scams, and those companies are doing nothing to prevent that. In fact, they're selling advertising services to the people that are doing it, and there are death threats against politicians. I saw on the news the other day that the Auckland mayors had to have more security because of some of these threats against him. This is appalling. Lies, defamation, theft of content, and at its heart is the fact that these companies are protected from any liability for the dangerous product that they sell. And I think that until the world deals with something like that, or maybe what the Australians are doing with under 16-year-olds not being able to get a social media account, until that, the lies that we see pervading the world will prevail over truth, and we risk demagoguery and dictatorship, because dictatorships thrive on propaganda, not truth.
What can a country like New Zealand do about it then?
Well, we could, if we could lead on the issue, we could actually remove the exclusion of liability that sits in our law and leave it to the courts to sort out the balance between freedom of expression and the duty not to sell a harmful product. I like that idea personally, because I don't like the idea of government being a censor. I think it should be up to those social media companies to prevent the harms that they're causing, including from foreign actors using AI and bots to actually just push messages during elections which are dishonest. So I think I was Trade Minister when Trump was last in power. By the end of the last term of his administration, the rest of the world was sick of it, and they started introducing digital services taxes. I think the rest of the world's now sick of these selfish tech billionaires who are ruining things. How much money do they need? How do they make their money? At the cost of people who bear the costs. Look at that building, that Netflix documentary on Netflix series in the moment, Adolescence, another symptom of the same problem.
There will be many people who agree with your criticisms, but is there a danger for a country like New Zealand in catching the ire of the Trump administration if indeed you do try and crack down on the social media platforms?
Well, you obviously have to be careful about it, but I think other democracies around the world are really worried about this. I met with a person in the House of Lords recently in the UK. She's given over her life to trying to get codes to protect young people. It's not going to work, and she gets death threats. It's all mucked up. And you look at your industry, the media that we relied upon for truth and for balance and to tell us who was lying and who was telling the truth. They're cleaned out by these internet giants who can steal their content, own none of the duties and defamation or broadcasting standards that you owe. It's just not fair. And I think there is those unfair settings that they can't last. I think the Wild West of social media has to end. And I really do think they are megalomaniacal, tax-avoiding tech billionaires. They are greedy, they're selfish, they don't need any more money. They should not ruin our democracies.